Be serious when it comes to serious things. Know when to be serious and then know when to have fun. This is the time to get serious. Muslims today are taught that their holy book, the Qur'an, is the direct speech of their God, Allah. They believe that the Qur'an is eternal and therefore has always been preserved on tablets in heaven. Muslims believe that through revelation by the angel Gabriel, this eternal Qur'an, the eternal speech of Allah, was revealed a little at a time to their Prophet Mohamed in Mecca and then Medina between 610 and 632. According to the standard Islamic narrative, there is only one Qur'an and it has been perfectly preserved and therefore has not been tampered with in any way for the last 1400 years, and the Qur'an that exists today is complete, unchanged, and exactly as it is on the tablets in heaven, and exactly as was revealed to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel in the 7th century.
It is no other book on the face of the earth that can make a claim, being a revelation that has been preserved meticulously. Have no doubt whatsoever that the Qur'an has been preserved to the letter, to the dot, and to the sound.
Let's see if the standard Islamic narrative is reliable. Very early in the history of Islam, and according to Islam's own sources, there are accounts of problems with the transmission of the Qur'an, and therefore its alleged perfect preservation.
Let none of you say, I have acquired the whole of the Qur'an. How does he know what all of it is when much of the Qur'an has disappeared? Rather, let him say, I have acquired what has survived.
When Muhammad died in 632, the Qur'an had not been written down in book form. According to the standard Islamic narrative, it had been memorized by his companions, and some of it had been scrawled onto stones, bones, and palm leaves, as told in Al-Bukhari, Volume 6. We'll come back to this later. In 632, during the First Caliphate, at the Battle of Yamama, a significant number of Islamic fighters who each had specific parts of the Qur'an memorized were killed in that battle, and the parts of the Qur'an they held in their memories were lost forever.
Many of the passages of the Qur'an that were sent down were known by those who died on the day of Yamama, but they were not known by those who survived them, nor were they written down, nor had Abu Bakr, Umar, or Uthman by that time collected the Qur'an, nor were they found with even one person after them.
So Abu Bakr, who was the first caliph, took the responsibility to have the Qur'an compiled and written down so as to prevent any further loss of the Qur'an in this way. He commissioned the scribe or secretary of Muhammad, Zayd ibn Thabit, to go and seek out everyone who had parts of the Qur'an memorized and to write down and compile what they remembered, and to include also that which had been scrawled onto stones, bones, and palm leaves, and put them together to form the first Quranic manuscript. That first Qur'an was then given to one of the widows of Muhammad, Hafsa, for safekeeping. She puts it under her bed, and there it stays for 20 years. 20 years later, in 652, the third Caliph Uthman comes to power after Umar, the second Caliph, dies. Uthman discovers that there are multiple different versions of the Qur'an in circulation that do not agree with each other. This comes to light after another battle in the north near the regions known today as Armenia and Azerbaijan. The Muslims that had gathered from Medina, Damascus, and other places to join forces in the battle came together after to pray to give thanks to their Allah for victory. But the Muslims from Medina, hearing the other Muslims recite from a different version of the Qur'an, were incensed by this and wanted to fight the other Muslims. So, on hearing about this debacle, Uthman decides to have Hafsa's copy collected, and he again calls on the services of Zayd ibn Thabit and tasks him and 3 others to take the original Quranic manuscript that Zayd had put together and left with Hafsa and rewrite it only in the Qurayshi dialect. So according to the standard Islamic narrative, the original Qur'an that had been under Hafsa's bed for 20 years was rewritten in 652 in the Qurayshi dialect. Then Uthman has all the other versions of the Qur'an burned. Then this new Uthmanic Qur'an was further copied and sent out to every Islamic province in an attempt to standardize the Qur'an and stamp out all other variants. So where should we begin? Let's start with the gathering and compilation of the first Quranic manuscript by Zayd ibn Thabit, ordered by the first Caliph Abu Bakr. This would have been no easy task. Zayd ibn Thabit is reported to have said,
If Abu Bakr had ordered me to shift a mountain among the mountains from one place to another, it would not have been heavier for me than this.
Bear in mind now, Zayd is not the prophet nor a prophet. He is doing all of this work, gathering fragments of the Quran from various sources. How would he know what was faithful to that which was revealed? What is accurate from what is embellished? What about the men Zayd collected the Quranic verses from? Were their memories reliable? How would he know what is true from what may have been fabricated? If the Quran had been so well preserved in the memories of Muslims, why didn't Abu Bakr just have 2 or 3 reciters sit down with Zayd ibn Thabit and recite the whole Quran? Zayd could have written what they had recited to him, and that would have been that. The only problem Zayd should have had was a well-worn pen from all of that writing, but that was not the case. We have indications from the Islamic sources themselves that within about a year after Muhammad's death, the transmission of the Quran had already broken down. As mentioned earlier, certain passages that were held in the memories of potentially hundreds of Islamic fighters were lost forever when they were killed in battle. How can Muslims claim perfect preservation if this loss of scripture is recorded very early on in their sources? And furthermore, what about the parts of the Quran that were written on bones and vegetation? Who's to say that every single scrap was gathered, or that which was gathered survived the everyday environment and was legible? Trying to collect and compile completely and accurately all of the early Quran, the way the standard Islamic narrative says Zayd ibn Thabit was supposed to have done it, would have been a monumental, if not impossible, task. Another pressing question. Other variants of the Quran very early on? Where did all of these other versions of the Quran come from? The only Quranic manuscript should have been the one under Hafsa's bed collecting dust. How would anyone know what should have been contained in the Quran to make variants of it? Zayd ibn Thabit, according to the standard Islamic narrative, was the only person with all of the information, as he was the one who had gathered everything together. And Uthman? Why did Uthman feel the need to rewrite the original first manuscript of the Quran, something that should have been perfect? If he wanted to preserve the Quran and stamp out variants, would it not have made more sense for him to have the original manuscript copied and distributed instead of commissioning his own variant of the Quran and distributing that? Muslims would say that the differences in the variants were in dialect only. But the narrative falls apart even further here because at that time in the 7th century, when the Uthmanic Quran was supposed to have been compiled, there was just the classical written consonantal Arabic. There were no written Arabic dialects. To have different dialects in written Arabic, you need the diacritical marks. These are the vowel symbols, the dots above and below the line, in addition to the consonantal Arabic. So how can you have dialectical differences in written Arabic in the 7th century when there were no diacritical marks then?
Due to such limited use of diacritical marks in the earliest Quranic manuscripts, as well as the variant oral reading traditions, and also because Muhammad may have allowed leeway in the reading of each word, it is sometimes not possible to have confidence in the original meaning of the consonantal text standardized by Caliph Uthman around 650 CE.
Can you see the problem here? If the Quran was so important, why leave it gathering dust under a bed for 20 years? Why did no one think to make copies of the first original Quranic manuscript? Why, if the Quran is the direct speech of Allah and of the utmost importance, as it supposedly is the final revelation that supersedes all before it, why wasn't Zayd ibn Thabit's skills used to collate the Quran as it was being recited and shared by Muhammad while he was still alive? Why wait until Muhammad dies and people who held Quranic verses in their memories had died and unique parts of the Quran were lost to begin to compile it? And why does the narrative say that Uthman had the Quran rewritten in the Qurayshi dialect when there were no written Arabic dialects in the 7th century? Do you see the holes in the narrative? This weak narrative surrounding the compiling of the early Quran comes to us from Al-Bukhari Volume 6, Hadith 509 and 510, written in the late 9th century in 870. That's over 200 years after these alleged events. He is the only source for this. None of this information about compiling the early Quran comes from any source in the 7th century. It's all from the 9th century and possibly further embellished later.
Just because it's written in Arabic doesn't mean it's the gospel truth.
Even further to these serious issues with the transmission and perfect preservation of the Quran, even though according to the standard narrative, Uthman had the original Quranic manuscript rewritten in a single dialect, and the variants at that time destroyed. Other versions still surfaced. In Damascus later in the 7th century, according to Islamic tradition, Ubay ibn Ka'b, who was said to be a companion of Muhammad, had his own version of the Quran containing 116 surahs. Also in Kufa, Ibn Mas'ud has his 110 surah version, and in Basra, Ibn Musa had his 114 surah version of the Quran. That's more than one Quran, and differing amounts of surahs from what we are told should make up the Quran. And to this day, there are still multiple versions of the Quran in circulation, with differences in the text as compared to one another, and in comparison with the oldest manuscripts. These are facts which are not known by most Muslims. The Hafs text is the main Quranic text in circulation today, followed by the Warsh reading of the Quran. This text, even though it is said to have originated in the 8th century, was only chosen in 1924. That's 100 years ago. It was chosen in Cairo, Egypt, because there were many different texts of the Arabic Quran, about 37 floating around the Islamic world. Not different translations, but actual different Arabic Qurans. And there wasn't a standard Quran for students in Cairo's schools to memorize and recite. And this was causing problems, as in the early days of Islam. The schools could not have standardized tests because there were so many differences in these Qurans. The students were giving different recitations for the same surahs, as they had been reading different versions and therefore had memorized them differently. And why did they choose Hafs? He died around 140 years after Muhammad lived. He never knew Muhammad or anyone close to him. He came from Kufa and lived nowhere near where Muhammad had lived. He lived hundreds of miles away and 140 years later. But still, out of the many, it was his text that was chosen as the official text for all the schools in Cairo. What did they do with all the other texts? They took them all to the Nile River and they threw them in. This time, they didn't burn them. By 1936, they realized that what they had done in Cairo was successful, as now they could have standardized tests. So they decided to take this nationwide. In 1985 in Saudi Arabia, they had taken notice of what had happened in Egypt and seen its success, so much so that the Saudis wanted to make this change worldwide. So King Fahd, the Saudi king at that time, standardized the Hafs text and made it the official text of the Quran all over the world. That was only 39 years ago. But even though this was done, still to this day, there are multiple different Quranic texts around the world. Can you see the problem here? There have already been tens of thousands of textual variations discovered between at least 30 of these Qurans.
Through the abundance of opportunities to make mistakes, it is likely true that the Quran has been altered, at least through grammatical changes, individual letters, and sometimes changes to individual words, so that we cannot be sure which, if any, of the variant reading traditions and associated manuscripts correctly preserve the original Quran to the letter or even to the word, as many claim.
Even between Hafs and Warsh there are differences. Here are but a few of many examples. So much for there is only one Quran and perfect preservation.
It's very clear to you and to every single very advanced student and specialist that the standard narrative has holes in it.